In the final, frantic days of April 1861, Washington, D.C. was a city under siege, an island of federal authority in a sea of secessionist fervor. 5 days after the surrender of Fort Sumter, the 1st Volunteer Regiment summoned by President Abraham Lincoln to defend his capital had to fight their way through a hostile Maryland. In Baltimore, a pro-secessionist mob, which might just as well have been labeled urban guerrillas, attacked the 6th Massachusetts Infantry as it marched between train stations. They were pelted with stones and fired upon, the first blood of the Union defense shed not on a battlefield, but on a city street. In the aftermath, saboteurs fanned out across the countryside, cutting telegraph lines and ripping up railroad tracks, effectively isolating the capital from the loyal North. For days, an unnerving silence descended upon the executive mansion, the government's fate hanging precariously in the balance. It was in this atmosphere of profound anxiety that Lincoln had his first meaningful encounter with the men who would form his army. When the battered soldiers of the 6th Massachusetts, some still nursing their wounds, came to pay a visit to the White House, they were, as Lincoln's secretaries John Nicolay and John Hay observed, a little shy, having the traditional New England awe of authorities and rulers. But the man who greeted them was not an imperious ruler. Lincoln received them with a sympathetic kindness which put them at ease, offering sincere thanks for their patriotism and their suffering, and warm praise of their courage. As he spoke to them of the city's perilous situation, contrasting their prompt arrival with the unexplained delay which seemed to have befallen the regiment supposed to be somewhere on their way, his tone shifted. A raw, intense feeling broke through the presidential facade, a feeling of frustration and near despair that revealed the immense strain he was under. In a moment of startling candor, he confessed his own vulnerability to these common soldiers. "I begin to believe," he said, his voice laced with an irony born of desperation, "that there is no North. The 7th Regiment is a myth. Rhode Island is another. You are the only real thing." In that moment of shared uncertainty, a bond was forged. It was not a bond built on the president's military prowess, for he had none, but on his palpable humanity. The soldiers saw not just a commander-in-chief, but a man as burdened and isolated as they were. This shared vulnerability, this admission that they were all in this terrifying new reality together, laid the foundation for a relationship unique in American history. The truth was, the new president was almost comically lacking in military experience. His only service had been a brief combat-free stint as a captain in the Illinois militia during the 1832 Black Hawk War, an experience he famously joked had involved a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. Tsetse. His most notable engagement with military affairs during his single term in Congress had been as an outspoken critic of President James K. Polk's war with Mexico. He knew little of actual warfare, and even less about the immense complexities of deploying modern armies. His inexperience showed in the early days of his administration. He sowed confusion during the Fort Sumter crisis by issuing conflicting orders to the Navy, and appointed Simon Cameron, a Pennsylvania politician known to be a poor and possibly corrupt administrator, as his first Secretary of War. At military functions, the lanky president appeared out of place, failing to return salutes properly, a man still growing into the awesome responsibilities of his office. This unfamiliarity with the business of war would have catastrophic consequences in the summer of 1861. Bowing to intense political pressure for a swift, decisive victory that would crush the rebellion in one blow, Lincoln pushed his army to mount an immediate assault on the Confederate capital of Richmond. When his generals warned that the 75,000 90-day volunteers who had flocked to the colors were too green and inexperienced for a major offensive, Lincoln brushed their concerns aside with a fatally simplistic assessment. "They are green also," he said of the Confederates. "You are all green alike." The result was the humiliating Union rout at the First Battle of Bull Run, a disaster that shattered the North's naive illusions of a short war and sent Washington into a state of utter demoralization. Yet, even amidst these early blunders and the crushing defeat, the seeds of affection planted in that first meeting with the Massachusetts soldiers began to grow. Astonishingly, the men in the ranks developed a deep and abiding fondness for their civilian commander. Throughout the army, they began to refer to him in explicitly familial language, calling him Uncle Abraham, Uncle Abe, and, most enduringly, Father Abraham. This affection was not a later development born of victory, but an early sentiment forged in the crucible of uncertainty. As early as 1862, when the charismatic General George B. McClellan's popularity with his troops was at its peak, Sergeant Felix Brannigan of the Army of the Potomac wrote home to his sister with a stunning assessment. McClellan's popularity, he insisted, will never measure the 1/100th part of honest old Abe's. The reason was simple. Old Abe is the soldier's friend, and the man above all men in the right place. The soldier's friend, the father of the Union Army. It was a relationship that defied military logic, born not of command authority, but of a shared and honestly expressed vulnerability in the face of an unimaginable storm. The Forge of Command. Learning War on the White House Lawn. The humiliating defeat at Bull Run served as a brutal education for Abraham Lincoln. The prairie lawyer who entered the White House almost entirely ignorant of military affairs now understood that he could not simply delegate the war to his generals. He faced a steep learning curve, made steeper by the fact that many of the nation's most talented and experienced Army officers, men like Robert E. Lee, had defected to the Confederacy. If the Union was to be saved, the commander-in-chief would have to become a student of war, and he threw himself into the task with the same methodical intensity that had defined his legal career. The White House became his personal war college. He became a voracious reader, checking out books on military strategy and history from the Library of Congress and absorbing their lessons. He meticulously observed the campaigns, studying the successes and failures of both Union and Confederate commanders, drawing his own apt conclusions from the dispatches that flooded his office. His engagement was not merely theoretical. In a sight that must have astonished Washington society, the President of the United States could often be seen on the White House lawn or the grounds south of the Treasury, personally test-firing new models of rifles and repeating carbines. This was not the behavior of a distant statesman. It was the hands-on approach of a man who knew that victory would depend on the tools placed in his soldiers' hands and who was determined to understand the mechanics of the conflict from the ground up. This immersion in the art of war soon led to a deep and abiding frustration with his high command. After the brief tenure of the aged Winfield Scott, Lincoln placed his hopes in the dashing young General George B. McClellan, a man of immense organizational talent who was beloved by his troops. But McClellan proved to be a bitter disappointment. Despite Lincoln's constant prodding, Little Mac seemed constitutionally incapable of committing his magnificent Army of the Potomac to a decisive battle. Lincoln, growing ever more confident in his own strategic sense, resorted to a campaign of patient persuasion. Rather than issuing blunt orders that might provoke a crisis with the popular and arrogant general, he sent a stream of carefully reasoned messages, 45 of them over a 4-month period during the Peninsula Campaign, gently encouraging, questioning, and urging McClellan to act. In one such message, he artfully balanced deference with strategic guidance. "You know, I desired, but did not order, you to cross the Potomac below, instead of above the Shenandoah and Blue Ridge. My idea was that this would at once menace the enemy's communications." The patience, however, eventually ran out. After McClellan allowed Lee's army to escape after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln's assessment was pithy and final. "I said I would remove him if he let Lee's army get away from him," Lincoln informed a colleague, "and I must do so. He has got the slows." The more his generals frustrated him at the strategic level, the more Lincoln seemed to invest in his personal relationship with the enlisted men. His frequent visits to the army camps were a stark contrast to his tense dealings with their commanders. He moved among the soldiers with what journalist Noah Brooks called an unaffected cordiality and good fellowship difficult to describe, a manner completely free of condescension. When Lincoln was with his troops, Brooks observed, the common soldier was the equal of the chief magistrate of the nation. These visits were not merely for show, they were genuine interactions that left a lasting impression on the men. One private, standing in review after a long, tiring march, recalled being hungry and thirsty, but as the president rode past, his kindly smile and careworn face stirred something deep within him. My heart warmed toward the great man, the soldier remembered, and I whispered softly to myself, I'm glad I enlisted. These encounters became a rich source of Army folklore, revealing a commander who saw his men as individuals. He impressed a sharpshooting regiment by taking a hand at target practice himself, remarking with a grin, Boys, this reminds me of old-time shooting, as the soldiers cheered and waved their hats. His famous humor was another tool for connection. Meeting a soldier in camp who was even taller than his own 6-foot-4-inch frame, Lincoln looked the man up and down and asked with mock seriousness, Say, friend, does your head know when your feet are cold? This easy, egalitarian manner was a form of leadership his generals could not replicate, and it built a reservoir of loyalty that would prove indispensable. His direct engagement was, in a sense, a form of reconnaissance. Unable to get a clear and reliable picture of his army's morale and capabilities from a command structure he increasingly distrusted, Lincoln went to the source. By talking with the privates and corporals, he was bypassing the official channels and taking the true measure of the men whose lives depended on his decisions, and on whom the fate of the Union ultimately rested. A higher purpose. The President, his soldiers, and emancipation. For the first year and a half of the Civil War, President Lincoln and the vast majority of his soldiers were in agreement on one fundamental point. The war was being fought for a single, sacred purpose, the preservation of the Union. Lincoln was adamant on this point, stating plainly that his paramount objective in this struggle was to save the Union, and not to save or destroy slavery. This was not an abstract political theory, but a calculated strategic necessity. He moved with extreme caution, actively resisting early emancipation efforts by generals like John C. Fremont, whose 1861 decree freeing the slaves of Missouri rebels Lincoln swiftly countermanded. The president's great fear was alienating the crucial border slave states of Maryland, Missouri, and especially his native Kentucky. As he bluntly explained, I think that to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we cannot hold Missouri, nor, as I think, Maryland. This singular focus on Union was echoed in the camps. The citizen soldiers who had volunteered in 1861 and 1862 had, for the most part, not enlisted to fight an abolition crusade. Hiram F. Covey, a soldier in a Michigan infantry regiment, spoke for many when he wrote home in the summer of 1862 that the war was not get up to put down slavery, but to preserve the Union, and to put down treason traitors. For these men, the cause was clear and contained. They were fighting to restore the nation that had been, not to create a new one. But the battlefield is a brutal and effective teacher. As the war dragged on, its casualty list swelling to horrific proportions, a profound shift in thinking began to occur, both in the White House and in the ranks. Soldiers confronting the reality of the Confederacy firsthand began to see slavery not as a tangential political issue, but as the very heart of the rebellion. A Wisconsin camp newspaper stated what was becoming obvious to many: the fact that slavery is the sole undeniable cause of this infamous rebellion is as plain as the noonday sun. This was more than a moral realization, it was a strategic one. A Union cavalryman explained the military logic with perfect clarity. The institution of slavery allowed a huge proportion of white Southern men to join the Confederate Army, leaving their Negroes are at home raising crops to support their families. To strike at slavery was to strike at the Confederacy's economic and logistical foundation. Freeing the slaves would compel the white men, to come home to look after the welfare of their families and go to work themselves or starve. One soldier from the Midwest observed the changing sentiment in his camp, writing, "You have no idea of the changes that have taken place in the minds of the soldiers in the last 2 months. Men of all parties seem unanimous in the belief that to permanently establish the Union, we must first wipe out the institution of slavery." Lincoln's own thinking was evolving along a parallel track. The evidence that slave labor sustained the Confederate war effort was becoming undeniable. By the summer of 1862, he had concluded that a change in policy was essential. As he later explained to his cabinet, emancipation had become a military necessity, absolutely necessary to the preservation of the Union. We must free the slaves or be ourselves subdued. In early October 1862, just 2 weeks after the bloody Battle of Antietam, Lincoln visited the army in the field. He spent days reviewing the troops and, more importantly, grieving with them over the 24,000 men dead, wounded, or taken prisoner in that single horrific day of fighting. Surrounded by the staggering human cost of the conflict, he returned to Washington and, on January 1, 1863, issued the final Emancipation Proclamation, transforming the war's purpose. The reaction in the ranks was complex and deeply divided. For many soldiers, particularly those with Democratic sympathies, it was a profound betrayal. Benjamin B. Brock of the 26th Michigan Infantry wrote angrily, "I did not think when I enlisted that I was going to fight for the Negro. But when I get here I found out that I was a-going to fight, I just turned my coat." Charles S. Wainwright, an officer in the Army of the Potomac, lamented bitterly in his diary that good men were now dying for a cause they had not signed up for, perishing for the freedom of a people he considered inferior. Yet, for many others, the proclamation was a welcome, if overdue, dose of strategic and moral clarity. It officially sanctioned a conclusion they had already reached in the field. Private Levi Hines wrote with triumph that the late proclamation of the President makes it a war on slavery, expressing his gladness that Lincoln had finally recognized the necessity of fighting for the purpose of ending that hellish curse of our country. Another soldier, David Lane, observed that the Union's military fortunes seemed to turn for the better only after emancipation became the fixed policy of the government. Lincoln had not so much imposed a new cause on his army as he had ratified the harsh lesson it had learned in blood. His genius was in his timing, waiting until a critical mass of his soldiers had been educated by the war itself to see that the Union could not be saved without destroying the institution that had sought to tear it apart. The agony of a father. Mercy from the executive mansion. As the war progressed, Washington, D.C. transformed into a city of pain. The capital was ringed by sprawling temporary hospitals, with shed hospitals covered acres on acres in every suburb. The endless roll of the army wagon and the rattle of the anguish-laden ambulance became the city's grim soundtrack. For President Lincoln, these sights were inescapable. His daily 4-mile commute between the White House and his summer retreat at the Soldiers' Home took him past these hospitals, as well as contraband camps and newly dug cemeteries, constant, visceral reminders of the war's staggering human cost. This daily immersion in the consequences of his decisions profoundly shaped his command, fostering a deep paternal empathy that would become the hallmark of his relationship with his men. Lincoln became a frequent and often unannounced visitor to the city's military hospitals. He would simply appear in a ward and move from cot to cot, shaking the hand of every soldier, offering a kind word. He and Mrs. Lincoln often brought small comforts like fruit and flowers, gestures that always cheered the men. What he saw on these rounds often left him shocked and horrified, but it also sharpened his focus on the individual soldier's experience amidst the vast, impersonal machinery of war. A story told by an army surgeon perfectly captures this perspective. After a hospital visit, Lincoln stopped to chat with the doctors. One of them was proudly describing a difficult and technically complex operation he had just performed, removing a wounded soldier's arm at the shoulder joint. The other surgeons listened intently, asking questions about the procedure. Lincoln waited until they had finished, then broke in with the one simple question that none of the medical professionals had thought to ask. But how about the soldier? This concern for the individual found its most powerful expression in his use of the presidential pardon. The military justice system was harsh, designed to enforce discipline through fear. Crimes like desertion or falling asleep on picket duty were capital offenses, and Army officers strongly supported the death penalty to set an example for others. Lincoln, however, often saw these cases differently. He famously referred to them as his leg cases, reasoning, "If Almighty God gives a man a cowardly pair of legs, how can he help their running away with him?" The most famous of these cases was that of Private William Scott of Vermont, the sleeping sentinel. In 1861, Scott, exhausted after 2 consecutive nights on duty, fell asleep at his post and was subsequently court-martialed and sentenced to be shot. The case came to Lincoln's attention, and he intervened. In a scene that became legendary, Scott was led before the firing squad, his death sentence was read aloud, and then, at the last possible moment, a second order was read: a full pardon from the president. One popular version of the story holds that Lincoln later told Scott, "I am going to trust you. Now what I want to know is, how are you going to pay my bill? If from this day on William Scott does his duty, my bill is paid." 7 months later, at the Battle of Lee's Mill, William Scott was mortally wounded, having paid his debt in full. When personal intervention was not possible, Lincoln wielded his pen to offer solace. His letters of condolence are masterpieces of profound empathy. In December 1862, he wrote to Fanny McCullough, the young daughter of a slain friend and fellow Illinoisan. Drawing on the memory of his own mother's death when he was a boy and the recent agonizing loss of his son Willie, he wrote with the authority of shared grief. "In this sad world of ours, sorrow comes to all, and to the young it comes with bitterest agony because it takes them unawares. You cannot now realize that you will ever feel better. Is not this so? And yet it is a mistake. You are sure to be happy again." 2 years later, he penned his most famous letter to a Boston widow named Lydia Bixby, who was believed to have lost 5 sons in battle. "I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming," he wrote, before offering the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. The letter's power endures despite the messy historical realities that surround it, that Mrs. Bixby likely lost only 2 sons, may have harbored Confederate sympathies, and that the letter itself might have been drafted by his secretary, John Hay. The sentiment transcended the facts. These acts of mercy, in the hospitals, from the pardon desk and through his letters, were more than just the gestures of a kind-hearted man. They were a deliberate counter-strategy to the brutal, dehumanizing logic of war. While his generals managed the Army's tactics, Father Abraham was managing its soul, ensuring that his soldiers knew their individual sacrifices were seen, valued, and mourned by the man at the very top. A powerful ally. Black soldiers and the ballot. At the outset of the Civil War, the conflict was universally understood to be a white man's fight. When free black men in the North rushed to volunteer for the Union cause, they were turned away. A federal law dating from 1792 barred them from bearing arms for the U.S. Army, and President Lincoln, deeply concerned about driving the border states to secede, upheld this policy. In the early stages of the war, he flatly rejected the idea of recruiting black soldiers, privately admitting that he had no confidence they would fight effectively. The war, it was decreed, would be fought by white men to restore a union led by white men. The catalyst for changing this foundational policy was not a politician's speech or a general's request, but an act of incredible bravery by an enslaved man. In August 1862, Lincoln held what was perhaps his most consequential meeting of the war with an African American. His visitor was Robert Smalls, who, just 3 months prior, had executed a daring escape from Charleston by commandeering the Confederate transport steamer CSS Planter, navigating it past Southern forts, and delivering it to the Union blockading fleet. In their meeting at the White House, Smalls personally urged the president to allow black men to join the Army. Face to face with a man who had secured his own liberty with such courage and skill, Lincoln's skepticism crumbled. He finally embraced the idea, coming to see that arming black men was, as he put it, not a question of sentiment or taste, but one of physical force. Smalls left Washington bearing a letter from the War Department, authorizing the raising of black volunteers in South Carolina. The service of black soldiers was now deemed essential to winning the war. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, recruitment began in earnest, and in May 1863, the Bureau of Colored Troops was established to manage the effort. By the war's end, roughly 179,000 black men would serve in the U.S. Army, comprising 10% of its total strength, with another 19,000 in the Navy. Their service, however, came with systemic discrimination. They were placed in segregated units, always commanded by white officers, often received subpar weapons and equipment, and were frequently assigned to labor details rather than combat. They were also paid less, $10 a month, from which $3 was deducted for clothing, while white soldiers received $13 a month with no such deduction. Moreover, the men of the United States Colored Troops, USCT, faced a peril their white comrades did not. Official Confederate policy refused to recognize them as lawful combatants. Captured black soldiers faced the threat of immediate execution or re-enslavement, and their white officers were subject to severe punishment. In response, Lincoln issued General Order 252, threatening direct, harsh reprisal on Confederate prisoners of war for any mistreatment of his black troops. Lincoln's belief in the importance of this new force grew into a powerful conviction. He relentlessly pushed his governors and generals to raise more black regiments. To Andrew Johnson, the military governor of Tennessee, he wrote, "The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers upon the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once." He told General Ulysses S. Grant that he believed these soldiers were a resource which, if vigorously, applied now, will soon close the contest. Grant replied that he shared the president's belief, declaring, "By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally." The ultimate validation of Lincoln's controversial policies, emancipation and the arming of black men, came not on the battlefield, but at the ballot box. The presidential election of 1864 was a stark referendum on the war itself. Lincoln and the National Union Party stood for continuing the fight to achieve a total victory and reunification, while the Democratic Party, heavily influenced by its Copperhead wing, ran on a platform that called for a negotiated peace, even if it meant a divided country and the continuation of slavery. For the soldiers in the field, the choice was clear. Having sacrificed so much, the idea of an inconclusive peace that would render their suffering meaningless was abhorrent. They understood the folksy wisdom of the Lincoln campaign slogan, "Don't change horses in the middle of the stream." When the votes were tallied, the result was a landslide. Of the Union soldiers who cast ballots, an overwhelming 75.8% voted for Abraham Lincoln. This was more than a vote for a candidate. It was the Army's resounding endorsement of the war's new purpose. The blood and valor of the USCT had proven the military wisdom of emancipation, and now the entire Union Army, with its votes, ratified that strategy and the commander who had dared to implement it. The last full measure: the man and the myth. In the vast folklore that grew around Abraham Lincoln, no story better encapsulates the tender, paternal bond he shared with his soldiers than the tale of the barefoot private. The details vary in the telling, but the essence remains the same. The president, upon seeing a soldier marching without proper shoes, is so moved by the man's plight that he either gives the soldier his own boots or personally intervenes to ensure a new pair is provided. It is a powerful image of ultimate empathy. the head of state lowering himself to care for the most basic need of his humblest subordinate. Yet, for all its emotional resonance, the story appears to be just that, a story. There is no direct historical account of such an event ever taking place. It is a myth, but a myth that reveals a profound historical truth. The legend's power stems from its fusion of several authentic elements of the Lincoln story. The suffering of shoeless soldiers was a grim reality, particularly in the chronically undersupplied Confederate armies, where the need for footwear was so acute that it became the apocryphal cause for the start of the Battle of Gettysburg. Lincoln's own past also lent the story a ring of truth. He had grown up in poverty on the frontier and often went barefoot as a boy and young man, a fact he readily acknowledged. He understood intimately what it meant to feel the cold mud between one's toes. The story also echoes another piece of Lincoln folklore, the tale of his father being a humble shoemaker. According to this legend, when an arrogant senator tried to embarrass the new president by reminding him of his father's lowly trade, Lincoln masterfully turned the insult into a tribute to his father's superior craftsmanship, declaring himself proud to be the son of a man who poured his soul into his work. This story, too, is apocryphal. Thomas Lincoln was a carpenter and farmer, not a cobbler, but like the tale of the barefoot soldier, it reinforces the image of a leader deeply connected to the common man. The myth of the gifted shoes, therefore, is not about footwear, it is about recognition. In the face of the war's vast impersonal slaughter, it offers a comforting fantasy of perfect empathy, a belief that the man at the top saw and cared about the individual suffering of the men at the bottom. While the story of Lincoln giving his shoes is a legend, the story of his soldiers giving him their hands is a stark and poignant reality. On the night of April 14, 1865, as a bullet from John Wilkes Booth's Derringer tore through the president's brain, chaos erupted in Ford's Theater. In that moment of national crisis, it was not the politicians or the dignitaries who took charge of their fallen commander-in-chief, but a small group of his soldiers. 4 men from Thompson's Independent Battery C, Pennsylvania Light Artillery, Jabez Griffiths, William Sample, Jacob Soles, and a private named John Weaver were among those who rushed to the presidential box. With practiced care, they lifted the long, broken body of the president. Jacob Soles would later recall the solemn procession. "We 4 fellows carried him to the stairway in the theater, then 2 others fell in and helped carry him. As we carried him out of the theater, he was carried out flat, with his feet foremost." They moved slowly through the stunned and silent crowd, out of the theater and into the gaslit confusion of 10th Street. A young man directed them to a nearby boarding house owned by William Peterson. The soldiers navigated the long, narrow hallway and gently laid their commander on a bed in a small back room. A bed that was too short for his famous frame. It was the final intimate act of service between the president and his men. This last, tragic interaction brings the story of their relationship full circle. The bond that had begun 4 years earlier, with Lincoln offering comfort and solace to the first wounded volunteers of the 6th Massachusetts, ended here, with his soldiers tenderly carrying his mortally wounded body to the place where he would die. They carried him because he, in their collective memory, had carried them. He had carried their anxieties in the war's uncertain beginnings, their hopes for a higher purpose in its middle, and their grief for fallen comrades throughout. The myth of the shoes and the reality of that final procession are 2 sides of the same coin, each illustrating the profound and reciprocal devotion that defined the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and his soldiers. He was, to the very end, their president, and they were, in his final moments, his men.